All right. This is the American YAWP, chapter 27, the 60s. So, in this chapter, we're focusing, like the title suggests, on the decade of the 1960s. And the 1960s is a time period where there's a lot of activity going on. I would say the two major focuses or two major areas is the civil rights movement at home, and the civil rights in a lot of ways started in the decade earlier, the 1950s, but it's in the 1960s that the civil rights movement comes to its conclusion and becomes even more visible than it was in the previous decade. And the civil rights movement becomes a catalyst for a lot of change. The second major event is the Vietnam War. And there had been wars in the past. In fact, there had been a war in the 1950s in the Korean War, a war even before that in World War II. But there's something pretty different about the Vietnam War, and so both of these things, whether it's the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War, it marks a change of course or a change of direction for the United States. So when we think about the 60s, we associate it with things like strife, chaos, upheaval. Um, Turbulence is another way to describe, and we'll just say the 1960s is a decade of change. Of change. That's typically how we think about it. However, though, like a lot of other themes in our textbook, there's also the kind of counterpoint, and that is textbook mentions that at the same time, much stayed the same. And we can, you can find some of those, some of those points there. But generally speaking, when we think about the 1960s, it's again strife, chaos, upheaval, turbulence, and change. And nothing kind of better sets the stage than this decade of change, aside from the 1960 presidential election. This election followed the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Remember Dwight Eisenhower? A Republican, but a moderate Republican. And he was in office from 1952, following Harry Truman until 1960. When Eisenhower stepped down, he was, comparatively speaking, a relatively popular president. And given the affluence of the 1950s, it was a relatively successful presidency in terms of the domestic economic front, in terms of foreign policy in the Cold War. Nothing really got too out of control during Eisenhower's administration, and so it seemed as if he was, paving the way for his successor, Richard Nixon, who was also a Republican, to coast to a victory in the 1960 presidential election. However, Richard Nixon was running against John F. Kennedy, and in a lot of ways, um, John F. Kennedy represented change, right? He was a kind of a new political figure as far as American politics was concerned. So we'll say about the 1960 presidential election, this was, in some sense, a change versus a status quo uh, type of election. John F. Kennedy, some things that we could say about him. He was for the Democratic Party. He was young, young in age, but gave off more that youthful persona, youthful charisma. He was also trying to be the first Catholic president in American history. There'd never been a Roman Catholic or a Catholic president before, so he was breaking ground on that front. Wanted, in many ways, to continue New Deal, New Deal-ish programs. Remember the New Deal from Franklin Roosevelt. Kennedy had his own program that was called the New Frontier. And the New Frontier by Kennedy would have had many of the same types of legislation that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal had. Recall that Harry Truman had the Fair Deal. Not really a lot of that passed, but John Kennedy is a Democrat in that same kind of tradition, right? Looking to expand welfare, look after the well-being of citizens, job programs, stuff along those lines. He was running against Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the Republican, and Richard Nixon represented, in many ways, experience. In some ways, when you compare Richard Nixon to Kennedy, sometimes you would want to put young and old, but Nixon may have been perceived as old next to Kennedy, but I still think he was relatively young, actually, when he was running for president here. But Nixon was really running off of the experience. He had been vice president to Eisenhower. So Richard Nixon could represent a continuation of Eisenhower's policies. So for American voters, it was, Kennedy, youthful, the first Catholic president. Maybe in some senses, or maybe in some sense, there's a greater potential with a Kennedy presidency. Or do you go for the more safe, experienced alternative? And that was Richard Nixon. Well, the election was very, very close. In fact, it's one of the closest elections in American history. But there was a new technology that many historians consider to have played a very important role in this election. That was the television. And so, once again, the television strikes as a way of influencing, shaping American history. Because of the advent of the television by the 1960s, about 80, I think your textbook said 87% of American families owned a TV. Kennedy and Nixon performed the first televised presidential debates. We might say the first presidential debate. And during this debate, it was, people, we'll say, because a lot of people still tuned in to the radio, people who watched believed that Kennedy won. That is, in front of television cameras, Kennedy had better things like posture and body language. He spoke directly into the camera. He looked confident. He looked presidential. There was a new way of, because there was a new medium in the TV, it required a different approach. And, Kennedy captured that approach much better than Nixon did. Nixon was, fidgeting and looking all around. And while people on the radio couldn't really tell the difference, if you'd listened to the debate on the radio, their answers sounded good, but when you watch TV, it seemed that Kennedy was the superior one. And so, because the presidential election ended up being very, very closely, sometimes we point to the fact that, well, since this was the first televised debate, and maybe if there hadn't been a debate on TV, maybe Nixon would have gotten the nod. But a lot of people who tuned in believed that Kennedy had won, and in fact, Kennedy did win. Right, so 1960. John F. Kennedy becomes the next president of the United States. Richard Nixon is defeated. Now, immediately, Kennedy faces a major crisis in Cuba, and in fact, it's in Cuba that you have maybe perhaps during the entirety of the Cold War, the closest point to where the United States and the Soviet Union came to a direct conflict. It's also maybe the closest point that you could have had a very, very serious war that would have been incredibly detrimental, not just to the Soviet Union and the United States, but to all of human beings, right? If you want to be very dramatic about it, you can say that what happened in 1962 while Kennedy was president, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that perhaps this was the closest that we've ever come to becoming an extinct species due to the nature of the weapons that were held by the Soviets and the Americans. And if a war actually broke out and those weapons were used, there was the capacity to, as we mentioned in an earlier chapter, mutually assure the destruction of the other nation. So it all begins in Cuba. And recall that last time we talked about Cuba, this was all the way back in the Spanish-American War. And via the Roosevelt corollary, there was more or less a U.S.-backed Cuban regime. One of the things that the Americans really stressed during during the Spanish-American War way back in 1899 was the fact that Cuba ought to remain independent. But during the era of imperialism, a lot of those countries in Latin America never really had full independence, right? The United States through the Roosevelt corollary, more or less saw as Latin American nations as being somewhat like protectorate. So at the time, since the Spanish American War, when Cuba became an independent nation, there was, for the most part, a very popular US backed Cuban regime. However, though, in Cuba, there were lots of people who were against this regime and this government, and for various reasons. There were those who were nationalists that saw the United States as sort of informally or indirectly colonizing Cuba and wanted Cuba to have more independence from the United States. You also had the growing sentiment of communism, especially being, inspired by the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and you had decolonization, right? A lot of other countries were gaining their independence. So there was a coalition of anti-US, pro-Cuban sentiments that ultimately led to the Cuban Revolution. And the Cuban Revolution was when the pro-US government of Cuba was overthrown. And as a result, many, and your textbook mentions wealthy, many Cubans who had been allied with the United States, who had benefited from the American system or thought, more positively about America's role in Cuba, many of those Cubans fled to the U.S. Many of them ended up in Florida, specifically Miami, Florida. Fidel Castro, he was the leader of the Cuban Revolution. And this happened in 1959. Fidel Castro led it and installed, let's see, what does it say? Installed, we'll call it leftist economic programs. From the perspective of the United States, this was communism. And knowing what we know about the Cold War, the policy of containment, the domino theory, and all of the other things that guided American foreign policy during this time period, the fact that communism had spread to Cuba, had successfully taken over there, and Cuba is very, very close geographically to the United States. It's the first communist government in the Western Hemisphere. In some sense, even though there was a fear of communism in the 1950s, it never crossed the Atlantic Ocean to our side of the world. This posed a very serious threat, but it was occurring or had occurred when Kennedy was just coming into office and Eisenhower was just leaving. So the question is, well, what is the United States response? Well, before Kennedy stepped foot in office, the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, was already cooking up a plan to deal with the Castro regime, and that was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which John F. Kennedy did agree to. So this invasion was carried out. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an effort by the CIA to stage, say, an anti-Castro revolution using Cuban exiles, right? So some of those people who had fled to the United States, the CIA wanted to train them, arm them, get them to Cuba, and hopefully allow for them to counter-revolution, right? So Castro led the first revolution. The idea was that there would be a counter-revolution. Now, an important point here, and this is, again, as far as we talk about the Cold War and consider the, the size and scope of it, this in some sense is another one of these many, many, many proxy wars. However, though, and this was especially true under the Eisenhower administration, the United States was very cautious about provoking a larger conflict. So you might ask the question, why didn't the United States just full scale invade Cuba and take it back? And that was certainly a possibility. But again, the United States is always cautious of the Soviet Union and always cautious of sparking a larger conflict. So the idea of creating and this should be mentioned, right, in some sense, secret plan to make it look like, in fact, it was Cubans themselves leading the anti-Castro revolution and not the doing of the United States. that would do less to provoke the Soviet Union, and that is a major strategy as far as the Cold War is concerned. Unfortunately for President Kennedy, unfortunately for the Americans, unfortunately for the Cuban exiles, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Those that landed in Cuba were almost immediately captured by Castro's forces. The United States decided not to offer additional things like air support in fear of provoking a much larger conflict. And the sense was that the United States was involved. So the Castro regime remained in power, and the plan by the United States had failed. It's the Bay of Pigs invasion that sparks off the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, this here is really the big crisis of the 1960s and perhaps the biggest crisis of the Cold War. So, all of this context allows us to then say that the Cuban Missile Crisis was sparked by the Soviet Union sent nuclear missiles to Cuba, right? Nuclear missiles to Cuba. And the reason was one, the US had, we'll say, missiles in Turkey. Turkey is a country that is close to the Soviet Union. Cuba is a country that's close to the United States. So the idea is, well, if the United States gets to have missiles so close to the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union should have missiles close to the United States. But number two, related to the Bay of Pigs invasion, because Cuba wanted protection. The idea that the United States was, trying to overthrow the Castro regime, had done it secretly, had failed to do so. But if the United States wanted to renew its effort and give it another go, then there was nothing stopping that from happening. So putting missiles in Cuba could be potentially a deterrent, right, to prevent the Americans from trying to get rid of Castro. That was the idea. American spy planes discovered that there were nuclear missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy decided to give a public address to the country. Kennedy announced Soviet missiles in Cuba, and this, in some sense, this caused the panic. And Kennedy warned in his address that if the Soviets were to fire any of those missiles, the United States would retaliate in full form. Kennedy demanded the missiles be removed. Kennedy ordered an embargo of Cuba, not to allow any other military equipment get to the island. The premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, at the time, when Kennedy said remove the missiles, Khrushchev said no. And so there was, about 2 weeks in October of 1962 where people people went to sleep not knowing if they would wake up in the morning because things were so tense. And in fact, the type of diplomacy that Kennedy exercised during this Cuban Missile Crisis actually has a specific term. We sometimes use this term brinksmanship. Brinksmanship is a willingness to bring your side to the brink of conflict, neither side really willing to back down. And that was very important from the perspective of both the Soviets and the Americans, because if this is the Cold War and you want to win the hearts and minds of people around the world, you can't back down. You can't look like a coward. Kennedy is addressing not just Americans, but he is addressing the ideology of capitalism and democracy, and he can't back down in the face of the Soviet threat. So this was an incredibly tense time period, and again, people felt that at any moment, some sort of World War III or nuclear war could break out. Right here, we have some protesters here holding up signs showing their concerns over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But cooler heads did prevail, and no conflict was had. A compromise was being worked in secret between the Soviets and the Americans in order to de-escalate the crisis. The compromise more or less consisted of three parts. One, Soviets remove missiles from Cuba. The United States does the same from the nearby country of Turkey, which was a US and NATO ally. And three, US promises Cuban Castro sovereignty. Big reason why the Cuban Missile Crisis even began was because Cuba did want protection from the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. So the United States said, look, we won't mess with Cuba anymore. We'll allow, Castro's government and the communist government there to remain in place, which it does more or less to this very day. So that promise was upheld. As a result of a lot of those Cuban refugees coming to the United States, especially those that were more sympathetic to the American side, Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, passed the Cuban the Cuban Adjustment Act, and this allowed a hard time with my B's today. Cuban, even that looks ugly. Allowed. There we go. Cuban refugees to become U.S. citizens. Section 3, the civil rights movement continues. So let's recall that in the 1950s, there were some pretty important developments as far as civil rights is concerned. And once again, if there's any confusion about what civil rights means, it is to end Jim Crow segregation. We're talking about the social and political and economic conditions in the South that allow for separate or segregated institutions. So the black and the white hospital, the black and white school. This is what we mean when we talk about civil rights, ending that system, getting rid of this. In the 1950s, there were some pretty important moments as far as civil rights was concerned, namely the Brown v. Board decision. And this was specifically about ruling or deeming segregation unconstitutional, but very specifically about public schools. Even though Brown versus Board was passed in the 1950s, what you found across the American landscape was really a lack of enforcement. And so by the time that the 1960s rolls around, which is the decade in this chapter, there have been some pretty important developments as far as the law goes. But the reality is that it seemed as if the civil rights movement was slowing down a little bit. And so the 60s becomes a decade where the civil rights movement begins to confront this policy or begins to confront the lack of enforcement when it comes to something like civil rights laws or civil rights legislation. There tends to be more activity in this decade. A perfect example are the series of protests that broke out all across the country known as the sit-ins. The sit-ins first started in North Carolina, but we might say protests that started for African American. I think they were students. Students sat at the whites only section of a lunch counter. This was a lunch counter in a store that was only designed for white persons only. These four black students simply sat there. They weren't served. The store closed, and they came back the very next day and did the same thing. And so the sit-ins were a perfect example of an earlier blueprint that had been practiced earlier of nonviolence and civil disobedience. Civil disobedience means to break unjust laws. What was significant about the sit-in movements is that even though it started with 4 students in North Carolina, it soon spread across the country, and stores, because of this, were forced to desegregate. So we can think of the sit-in movements as being, not just following an earlier blueprint that the civil rights movement put here, nonviolence and civil disobedience, but also showing the what we might call like the impatience, right, with decisions like Brown versus Board, but also more confrontational. And that's how the civil rights movement changes from the 50s and the 1960s. It's willing to confront these discrepancies a little bit more aggressively. Other organizations joined Martin Luther King Jr.'s. We want to talk about important contributions from the 1950s. Is that a leader of the civil rights movement emerged, right? And that was Martin Luther King Jr. And his organization was the SCLC. But there were other organizations that began to pop up that were a little bit different than Luther's or King's organization. One of them was SNCC. SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And this was an organization that was younger, might say more willing to confront segregation. And, just, took civil rights from a slightly different angle than maybe Martin Luther King Jr. did. A perfect example was of this kind of like changing, more confrontational approach, this energetic approach, we might say, was Ella Baker. Ella Baker was, we'll call her a civil rights leader. And she went from the SCLC to SNCC. She just said that, the SCLC was too, maybe not too, but it was middle age, and what's the other one? Middle class. Very heavy on the Christianity, right? Martin Luther King preacher. There were also other organizations that were more confrontational. Another good one, SNCC is primarily students, a younger generation core, or is the Congress on Racial Equality. And they are responsible for probably the most confrontational protest during the civil rights movement, and that was the Freedom Rides. Most confrontational, maybe the most dangerous. And the Freedom Rides, these were a series of protests. I mean, I don't even know if protest is the right word, but a series of protests to test the, let's see, court ruling of desegregated interstate buses. So in an earlier chapter, we talked about how the court ruled that buses that traveled from one state to another, that you couldn't segregate those buses. You wanted to segregate a bus inside of a state, that was perfectly fine, but from one state to another, the Freedom Riders decided they would sit on these buses integrated, or would sit integrated. And I don't remember exactly where their beginning point was. I think it was from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, was essentially their destination. Now, the point is that the court had ordered that they should be able to sit in an integrated way, that blacks and whites would sit next to each other. But even though the court had ordered that, nobody had really tested it. And that's exactly what this, what these people were trying to do. They were trying to test to see if it was actually going to be enforced, kind of in the same way that Brown versus Board wasn't enforced. And they were met with a lot of resistance and a lot of violence. Some riders were beaten during this. Some were forced into the hospital. One of the buses firebombed, and federal troops had to be sent in to rescue them. So this marked a very this marked a different way to approach civil rights than perhaps the 50s. And of course, the images of these protesters being beaten up, which was sometimes true for people in the sit-ins too, right? They might be sitting down at a lunch counter and angry crowds and stuff throwing food at them and punching them and getting arrested. The images of buses being firebombed in the South, the federal government forcing to react. What a lot of these protests did in the 1960s was it forced civil rights back into the conversation, right? It wasn't going to be something that was overlooked, right? These protests made it in the news, they made it on television once again. And people like John F. Kennedy are going to be forced to answer, right, for this. And you see, especially with presidents like Kennedy, from the Democratic Party, which had the South be a pretty reliable voting base, you can't just ignore civil rights. And eventually, John Kennedy will come to support civil rights legislation, but it's in part because of some of the actions and activities. So even people like King, King was invited to go along with the freedom rides, and he turned it down. He thought it was too dangerous. The president thought it was too dangerous, but Orr was willing to go places and do things that other groups and people would not be willing to do. Eventually, though, the more confrontational approach did end up influencing King and the SCLC, and they become a little bit more confrontational themselves. The Albany movement, this was a coalition of all the various civil rights organizations. So we'll call this a coalition of groups like SNCC, the NAACP. Remember, the NAACP is kind of in the legal background, and the SCLC. And this was a way of civil rights movement organizations coming together. Because at the end of the day, although they might disagree a little bit on the tactics of the civil rights movement, they all agree on the same goal. And certainly prior, to major civil rights legislation, it was much easier to get on the same page. Another incident was James Meredith, who was set to become was set to be the first African American to attend, was it University of Mississippi? Yeah. University of Mississippi. When riots broke out. There's James Meredith here. So this was an episode that we might recall somewhat similar to Little Rock 9. Remember Central High School? That school was ordered to be desegregated, and at the time, the President Eisenhower needed to act, and he responded by sending in federal forces, upholding the court order Brown versus Board, and the Little Rock 9 became the first Black students to go to Central High School. John F. Kennedy now is faced with a somewhat similar circumstance, right? It's different. James Meredith is set to be the first Black man to go to the University of Mississippi. Riots are trying to prevent that. The question is, what is Kennedy going to do? And Kennedy does exactly what Eisenhower did. Sent in forces is the right word to assist Meredith. And James Meredith did become the first Black man to, here you can see his escorts, his bodyguards, to ensure that he became the first Black man to attend the University of Mississippi. So once again, we find Kennedy in the White House, despite having a different political party, right? Eisenhower was a Republican, Kennedy was a Democrat. But we find that we have a president now, at least by this point, 1962, 1963, that is willing to uphold the court order against desegregation or against segregation, and that is important. Now, eventually, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC did come around to the more confrontational approach that other organizations like SNCC and CORE had been having some success in using. Martin Luther King organized a protest in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, in some ways, was considered the kind of like the capital of segregation. We might call it the most segregated city in the U.S. Right? It was uh, ground zero. And the decision by King, King may have been adverse to something like this 5 years earlier, but by now he was willing to stage a protest in the most segregated city in the United States. And as a result of the Birmingham campaign, when civil rights protesters started marching in the streets of Birmingham, the police commissioner ordered fire hoses and attack dogs. We'll say the police used fire hoses and attack dogs against protesters. And once again, TV strikes and, the television, we'll say showed, we'll say, showed's maybe a good word. Country, the violence. Once again, you can imagine how onlookers of what's happening in Birmingham are interpreting the civil rights movement. And that is for all of these incidents, when you have nonviolent protesters being met with violence, that helps gain more support from people who are onlooking from the outside. And in some ways, when we look at earlier things like the sit ins and like the freedom rides, they are nonviolent protests, but they are trying to invoke or create a violent response so that way they could gain more support. And the Birmingham campaign was an example of that. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested during this campaign, and he wrote probably one of the more well-known writings that King has. Exactly where I'm going to put this, but we'll just say that King wrote with it H. Wrote, it's called Letter from a Birmingham jail. And that was while he was arrested during this protest. Using the strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience, King, obviously joined by others like Gandhi in India, spent a lot of time in prison. Right, if you're going to break the law or break immoral laws, you're going to find yourself in jail, and King is no different. Now, in some ways, King had become the face and the leader of the civil rights movement, while those who supported segregation were also getting their leader, and that was George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, and in some ways, he became the face of the pro-segregation crowd. He would even go on pro-segregation. He would even go on to run for president and do pretty well as a third party. In fact, if you consider just all of American political history and the success and failure of third parties, some of the most successful third party candidates in all of American history were pro segregation candidates during the 1950s and 1960s, George Wallace being one of them. And of course, the quote that is most closely associated with Wallace was the following: segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, George Wallace. Now, by this point, President Kennedy had come around to fully supporting civil rights legislation to get rid of the Jim Crow system in the South. But as far as getting that actually done, it would require Congress. Now, Congress would be needed, or Congress needed to pass a law in order to get rid of Jim Crow, but there was still a lot of opposition coming from Congress. Kennedy wanted civil rights legislation. The civil rights movement wanted legislation. You had organizations like CORE and SNCC and SCLC that were all united behind this effort. And so they staged what is the, maybe the most significant symbol of the civil rights movement, and that was the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. And he gave that before a crowd that had met in Washington. So we'll say civil rights supporters, right? All of them from all backgrounds, young, old, north, south, marched to DC. Again, Washington, D.C. is where the Congress meets to pressure Congress to passing civil rights legislation, right? A law. And at this point, President Kennedy had actually asked it. Now, the president does have a lot of influence if they ask for certain laws, but the president can't pass a law on their own. And so the civil rights law was making its way through Congress. Here we have George Wallace, or no, this guy, I believe, is George Wallace, blocking the doors of the University of Alabama not to integrate it. Again, segregation now, tomorrow, and forever. Here's Martin Luther King Jr. with a group of people marching on Washington, putting pressure on Congress. At the time, the gathering in Washington in 1963 was the largest gathering in American history. It was the largest protest. And because there were only 3 stations on television, every single one of them cut to the March on Washington. So people around the country were watching as Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech to, I don't know, like 250,000 people or however big the crowd was. So the civil rights law was making its way in Congress when tragedy struck. And this was an incident that completely shocked the entire country. That was the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1960. We don't really go into too much detail about Kennedy's assassination in this textbook, but we'll just say while running for re-election, because 1964 was an election year in Texas, Kennedy was shot and killed. And we won't go too far beyond that, but the question was, what would be the fate of the civil rights movement? Kennedy was a president who had supported it, and it would fall to the vice president, now president, which was Lyndon Johnson. This was Kennedy's VP, now president of the US. Now, on the one hand, Lyndon Johnson was a New Deal Democrat, so he was like, Kennedy before him, and he was like Truman, and he was like Roosevelt in terms of like investing in the welfare of the country, but he was also a Southern senator from Texas, from a segregated state. So this aspect really put a wrench into the future of civil rights. Now with a Southern president in charge, right? Kennedy was from Massachusetts. With a Southern president in charge, did that mean that the civil rights movement was doomed? Well, it turns out no, because amongst all the other things that we should know about Johnson, he was committed to civil rights. So the fact that he had represented a Southern state didn't matter, in fact, at all. And he saw one of Kennedy's legacies being carried out was to finish civil rights. And so it's Johnson that ends up being the president that signs the most important civil rights legislation. It's President Johnson that is the president when the civil rights movement comes to a conclusion. So you can see a couple of pictures here from Johnson. Here he is sitting with Martin Luther King Jr. and other supporters of the civil rights movement working on this law. Johnson himself, he was a good politician. He was a very tall, big, intimidating guy. And, this is what Johnson would do to other members of Congress to pressure them into passing legislation. They called him a close talker. He'd get right up into people's faces and almost bully them into passing laws. Your textbook calls this the quote unquote Johnson treatment. So not only did Johnson want to fulfill the civil rights movement, but he wanted to do so in the name of Kennedy, the slain president. And so finally, the civil rights movement comes to a sort of climax or an apex, and that is when Congress does finally successfully pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is the most important law regarding civil rights in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 barred segregation. Just get the sort of official definition of this here. In public accommodations, and outlawed discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, and national or religious origin. So, in a lot of ways, what this law sought to do was to close a loophole that many states in the South were able to exploit from the time period of Reconstruction all the way up until 1964. And recall that was the 14th Amendment. Now, I'd say that the 14th Amendment, the spirit of the 14th Amendment was that the 14th Amendment itself says equal protection under the law. The law applies to everyone equally. So it doesn't matter who you are. And this was done in the context of the Civil War when Southern states passed black codes saying there are law codes for whites and law codes for Black Americans. The 14th Amendment said, no, everybody has to be subject to the same law. So instead, the workaround was Jim Crow. Well, we'll keep all the laws the same, but we'll just divide society. Black and white schools, black and white hospitals, black and white restaurants. So the Civil Rights Act barred segregation, and again, in some ways, was fulfilling perhaps what the intended purpose of the 14th Amendment was, but it just wasn't fulfilled until almost 100 years later. Now, the civil rights movement itself is not quite yet complete, because also remember that in addition to the 14th Amendment, there was the 15th Amendment, which had to do with voting, and that was the 15th Amendment. It banned, we'll say, they banned. We'll just use the terminology of the amendment, not to be too vague here. It said one cannot be denied the right to vote based on race, color, or previous servitude. So, what was the way around this amendment? Because this one was a lot more explicit, right? You cannot deny someone the right to vote based off race, color, or previous servitude. Well, recall that laws like poll taxes were passed, literacy tests, right? And this was a way around this amendment. So, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, yes, the loophole on the 14th Amendment had been closed, but what about the 15th Amendment? So that's to say that the civil rights movement is not quite yet done. So after 1964, there were further efforts targeted at getting rid of these things: poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. The Freedom Summer was one such protest. This was an effort to register Black voters in the South. And even in 1964, uh, there were three murders of some of those who were part of the Freedom Summers trying to get people to go out vote. So there was still some activity that was taking place in order to remedy these problems. And a short while after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Congress responded with the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and this abolished, say, voting discrimination. And what that meant was things like poll taxes, literacy tests, all of the workarounds of the 15th Amendment that kept African Americans out of politics, those things had been finally abolished. So when we think about the entire scope of the civil rights movement, again, 1954 with Brown versus Board is typically when we say the civil rights movement started. But again, that's not quite accurate because there are civil rights before that. But we usually say 1964 is when it ended because, in many ways, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was all encompassing enough that it banned primarily the system of Jim Crow and segregation in the South. Section 4, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. So, as far as Johnson's presidency is concerned, there's three major things that Johnson is responsible for. One is civil rights, right? You're going to want to know that President Johnson was the one who signed civil rights legislation. The second one, which we'll cover here, is probably the most significant reform to welfare since the New Deal, and that is the Great Society. The third thing, covered in the next couple of sections in the next chapter, is the Vietnam War. And these are kind of Johnson's three major events during his presidency. So, what is the Great Society? Well, the Great Society, this is Johnson's program. Johnson's program for domestic welfare. It's also sometimes known as the War on Poverty, so wanting to eliminate poverty in the United States. We might say welfare to end poverty and racial injustice. As far as what Johnson's Great Society consists of, we'll talk about a couple of specifics here, but it's pretty expansive. All right, there's a lot of moving pieces in it, so we're not going to list every single thing associated with it, but just to give you an idea, it's investments in things like education. It is funding for things like arts and culture. It is investment into housing and things like food stamps, right? So there's a wide variety of domestic welfare programs that are designed to assist Americans, and the idea again is declaring war on poverty and eliminating it in the states. A couple of important specifics that are worth mentioning. One is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. In fact, there's a very significant change to laws regarding immigration in the United States, and this has a tremendous impact on demographics moving forward. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, this ended the restrictive immigration quotas from the 1920s. Because if you remember all the way back to whatever the chapter that was, during the 1920s, in response to the new immigrants of the Gilded Age, we had some of the most restrictive immigration laws in all of American history. And from the 1920s until 1965, immigration in the United States was relatively restricted. This ended in 1965. And so you see, for example, a lot more immigrants coming from Asia. Asian immigration had been outright banned, almost completely banned, and a lot more immigration coming from Latin America, Mexico, and other countries. So we tend to see shifts in demographics because of this change to immigration. The second thing that is also worth mentioning as part of Johnson's Great Society is Medicare and Medicaid. And these are probably the most significant, I would say, the most significant part of Johnson's Great Society. Both of these programs are designed to provide, we'll say access, provides access to medical care for the elderly and those in poverty. So medical access to the elderly and for those that are in poverty. Another interesting feature of Johnson's Great Society was in some of the way that it was administered. And, your textbook mentions that this was perhaps the most controversial part of the Great Society, and that was, I should say, community action. And this was a way, we'll say, a way of domestic welfare that allowed the disenfranchised to administer programs more hands-on. You're probably thinking, what the heck does this mean? Well, there was an idea that, if you look back at the New Deal and Fair Deal and other programs, that a lot of this stuff was very top down, right? It was the government down to the people. And so there was a sense that maybe that wasn't the best approach, right? That like welfare shouldn't be, I don't know, like not forced upon people, but there ought to be maybe a little bit more engagement there. And so community action was trying to, kind of get rid of this top-down approach a little bit. That was the idea. Have the people be more invested in the actual administering of the welfare programs themselves, and you might have more effective results as a result of that. So that was a unique feature or an interesting feature in possibly a way of doing welfare. In response, or not in response, I should say, but the Great Society programs and Johnson's domestic welfare program, it ends up being, in terms of its like consequences, did it work? Did it not work? It ends up being very controversial, right? Americans to this day continue to argue about the success and failure of Johnson's Great Society programs, whether or not it's a good thing or whether or not it's a bad thing. And really, where you stand on Johnson's Great Society program, his war on poverty, really comes down to where you stand politically. For example, despite the programs from the Great Society, the 1960s and society itself, it didn't seem like things were getting all that much better. And this was especially surprising in the wake of civil rights legislation. Following the passage of the Civil Rights Act and following the passage of the Voting Rights Act, there was a wave of race riots that broke out in cities across the United States. The most prevalent ones were in Watts, Los Angeles in 1965, in Newark, Jersey, 1967, and in Detroit in 1967. And so, businesses were destroyed, looting, murdering, so all being televised on TV. So the question was, well, one, it confused many Americans, especially in the wake of the civil rights, and required further investigation. But the question also became, why? And there are three reasons that we can attribute to some of the urban unrest or urban rioting that took place in the 1960s. One was African American frustration with things like housing, police brutality, and racial profiling. Number two, we're going to point to limited economic opportunity in the cities. And a feature of the 1950s, sometimes called white flight, and this was white flight refers to when white populations left cities for the suburbs, which had the effect of resegregating cities. Section 5, the origins of the Vietnam. So, in this section, we get to the outbreak of the conflict itself, or at least how we understand it in the United States, right? When we say the Vietnam. Now, from earlier chapters, we know a little bit more about the longer story of the conflict in Vietnam. That initially, Vietnam was a colony that was controlled by the French. French had passed it on to Japan in 1940. The French took control somewhere in the we'll say around the 1880s or so, right, during the height of imperialism. When Japan lost that conflict, France once again tried to reconquer it. And in 1945, the French desired to make it a colony once again. Unfortunately for the French, and unfortunately for the United States at the time, because it was when France tried to reconquer Vietnam after World War II that the US put their support behind France and their effort to reconquer the country. France was an important Cold War ally, so if France wanted to do something, else around the world, it was valuable for the United States to support their allies. That made the people who the French were fighting, the Vietnamese, side with the Soviet Union, and so we already saw, for example, and all of these are trying to colonize Vietnam. So if we're talking about Vietnamese liberation, those that want to liberate Vietnam from rule, they're going to be fighting against all these individuals. So again, in this iteration here, because the Americans are supporting the French, these Soviets are going to put support behind the Vietnamese. This effort to reconquer, though, came to an end in 1954 when the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. This was the battle that forced France's retreat. And so the United States understood that because France was now retreating or getting ready to retreat from Vietnam, that they couldn't simply just leave a vacuum, right, in Vietnam. And of course, the question came, well, who's going to come next? Because it was unacceptable for the United States to allow Vietnam to be controlled or ruled by the Soviet-backed Vietnamese nationalists who, would have installed a communist government, policies of containment and everything else. So when the French leave, they decided at the Geneva Peace Conference. This was a conference, to get the French out of Vietnam. This decided to leave Vietnam in two pieces. Again, if this sounds like a brokered record, if this sounds familiar, it's because it is. The North would be communist. The South would be capitalist. Right, divided into two temporarily. The UN would hold elections. To unite. So the French are gone. They're going to temporarily leave it between North and South. In North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, right? They're the ones who controlled it. These were the communists. In the South, it fell to the rule of No Dinh Diem, and No Dinh Diem became the, I guess you could say, ruler or even dictator of South Vietnam. No Dinh Diem, he was what we might call a U.S. backed, what's the terminology here? Anti-communist. U.S. ally. And we'll just say dictator of South Vietnam. Now, in Vietnam more broadly, Ho Chi Minh was the one who was popular. No Din Diem was unpopular. And so, what Diem did with, being a U.S. ally and getting some support of the United States because he was an anti-communist, he canceled elections. And the canceling of elections, and more broadly speaking, just the rule we might say of no Din Diem, we might say, started an insurgency against the US/DM regime. Again, in this question, who follows the French exit from, again, 1945 was when World War II ended. 1954 is when the French are forced to leave. Well, it's the Diem regime. Diem rules from 1954 until 1963. Now, Diem himself, yes, he is an anti-communist. So the United States likes the fact that they can use Diem to follow their policy of containment, because as long as Diem, cancels the elections, so the country can't be unified, and as long as he rules the South, it prevents communism from spreading from the North to the South, and so that's in line with the American goals of what they want to accomplish. But Diem is also not very popular, and in some sense, Diem is causing more problems than solutions. His unpopularity for that reason. In 1963, No Din Diem is assassinated. In 1963. And now, once again, the question is, well, in South Vietnam, who is really calling the shots? Well, for the most part, following the Diem assassination, it goes to the Vietnamese military with the ARVN, or the ARVN, is referred to. This is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. This is the Army for the South. And it's advised by US military leaders. When the French were in Vietnam back in the late 1940s and 1950s, the United States had sent advisors, they had sent money, they had sent weapons to support their French ally. Well, when the French left, a lot of those advisors stayed, and they stayed in order to advise Diem. Now he was facing a different kind of war, right? An insurgency against his regime. Well, when Diem was assassinated, more or less the responsibility for South Vietnam more or less goes to the army. And the question is, well, who's really in charge of the ARVN? In a lot of ways, it's the United States. And so now the US finds itself, again, maybe not like officially, but in a very practical sense, the United States finds itself responsible and in charge of South Vietnam, and trying to maintain it or prevent it from falling to communism becomes a major goal as far as American foreign policy goes. The forces that are fighting against the Diem and the US led regime are referred to as the VC, or the Viet Cong. Now, it's important to understand that as far as Vietnam goes, yes, there is a North Vietnam and there is a South Vietnam, but unlike the Korean War, the Korean War was a war in which, the two armies pushed back and forth, right? The South invaded, or the North invaded the South pushed back up, but there were more clearly defined battle lines. There were more of the battles took place between professional armies and soldiers. This is a little bit different. Most of the fighting takes place in South Vietnam. Right? This is where most of the fighting is. And it's much more of an urban versus rural type of war. And the VC, they occupy the rural regions of the country. And the ARVN, they occupy the urban areas or the city. It's also a war in which there is less of a distinction between civilian and soldier. Much more about guerrilla warfare, if you've ever heard that term before. Guerrilla warfare is like, hit and run tactics. It's disguising yourself as civilian to make it difficult for the enemy to distinguish who is soldier and who is civilian. It's a different type of conflict, right? It's a different type of conflict, not exactly like World War II or not exactly like Korea. So back in the United States, the question is, well, where does the United States stand on all this? And at the time when Kennedy was still alive, he did support DM and more broadly anti-communism. Again, I told you this was going to be easy when we first went over it, and that is every U.S. president for the most part is going to be anti-communist and follow the same principles of containment and Truman Doctrine and all those other things. But at the time, he had sent only 16,000 Americans in Vietnam. And you can go back and even look during French occupation. There have been maybe like 1,000 Americans and then 2,000 and 3,000. But the number of Americans that were in Vietnam slowly started increasing over time. By the time that Kennedy was killed, 16,000 Americans were there. But the big, big, big moment came in 1964 when President Johnson was president. And again, we think about Johnson's major, the major things that Johnson does as president. The Vietnam War is one of them. Johnson was someone that wanted to do more to prevent the Viet Cong and others from having success. He wanted to protect South Vietnam. But Johnson only had so much power as president of the United States. So, for example, he didn't have power of the purse that has the ability to allocate resources. Congress usually does that. But luckily for Johnson, there was an incident which took place that gave him more power to expand the conflict in Vietnam, and that was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is a very controversial because it has become clear now after the fact that what was initially reported that happened at the Gulf of Tonkin might not have been entirely the truth. So, in some ways, what happened at the Gulf of Tonkin and the consequences were, at the very best, the Americans were misled. At the very worst, Americans were lied to. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is when it was reported that an American battleship, the USS Maddox, was fired upon by North Vietnam. The report was that the North Vietnamese had attacked an American battleship. That allowed the Johnson administration to go to Congress and pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This granted Johnson the authority to escalate the war in Vietnam. I don't recall the exact verbiage, but I think the Gulf of Tonkin resolution says something like, the president can take all necessary measures. So now there really wasn't anything limiting Johnson from sending more support, and that's exactly what he did. And so when we think about the Vietnam War here in the United States, although we have a nice little background information of the conflict, right, how it developed in the, decades, maybe even almost a century before the actual Vietnam War started. In the United States, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution led to the Vietnam War. In 1965, as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that's when more American troops landed. So we might say U.S. troops landed, start of the Vietnam War. So that if we look back, 1964, there were 16,000 advisors. After the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, by the year 1968, so just 4 years later, there were 500,000 Americans in Vietnam, over 500,000. And really, the turning point was the resolution, right? After that, American forces increased very, very, very significantly. The general in charge of, preserving or preventing communism from spreading in South Vietnam was General William Westmoreland. We'll call him U.S. General in Vietnam. And what became clear somewhat early in the conflict was questions about victory, right? How would Americans measure victory? You're trying to win the hearts and minds. How do you really know if you're getting more support or less support? How do you know if someone's a communist or not a communist? And the answer is it's not very easy to measure, right? It's hard to measure, and this question of victory, it became somewhat of a controversy. Eventually, the United States settled on kill count as a measure of victory, and that was simply each and every day, each and every week, if we, the United States, killed more of the enemy than they killed of us, that meant that we were winning. And because of the technological advantage that the United States had, because of the financial advantages the United States have, pretty much every day the United States was winning the Vietnam War because um, each and every day more of the enemy, more of the Viet Cong would be killed than American and ARVN soldiers. But recall the kill count or the body count, as they called it at the time. This turned out not to be a very good measure of victory because at the end of the day, if we're talking about hearts and minds, much of the strategy in Vietnam turned out to be counterintuitive. And that was yes, for every person that you kill on the other side, it means one less fighter against the United States. But American occupation actually started to turn a lot of the people against the United States. The longer that the US stayed there, the more people that the US killed, more and more people actually came to resent American occupation. And so, as you imagine, by going off a kill count, Americans were told they were winning. And that was all the way until the crucial year of 1968, which we'll mention here in another section. Section 6, Culture and Activism. The 1960s is also marked by a very unique cultural shift, and we can summarize this primarily as counterculture. In some ways, the mass culture, and mass culture was much more a phenomenon of the 1950s, right? Think about the uniform society, everyone owning a television, but only watching three television channels. It meant that, there was a sense of fitting in or a sense of uniformity. This is replaced by smaller subcultures, or maybe a better way of putting it is counterculture. That is kind of the opposite of the mass culture of the 1950s. So, counterculture, will just say this rejected the quote unquote fitting in culture of the 50s. Um, Things like individuality, that was something that was really downplayed in the 50s. Rebellion. There's a certain anti materialism slash consumption. A lot of the 1950s was this sort of material rise in standard of living. Americans were out there buying everything. So everything that the mass culture of the 1950s was, the counterculture of the 1960s was a rejection of that. And um, one way that you could measure this, and your textbook does make this point, is in advertisements. I think they look specifically at things like Volkswagen. The way in which companies sought to advertise to Americans was different, right? They wanted to stand out, to be unique, to be different, rather than fitting in, which was much more the norm of the era. A hippie or the hippies. This was a person who, I don't know, we'll say followed the counterculture, embraced counterculture. The slogan sometimes associated with hippies: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Right? That was again opposite. Drugs. Your textbook talks a little bit about LSD and acid, experimenting with drugs, looking for Again, less material experiences and more maybe like psychedelic or spiritual or emotional experiences. That was something very stressed in an earlier time. And the Woodstock Festival of 1969, this was a music festival, and it is probably the single largest, we'll just say a major symbol of the counterculture movement, of counterculture. All right, last section, section 8, beyond civil rights. So, when the civil rights movement concluded, and once again, we consider 1964 or 1965, the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the passage of the Civil Rights Act as the ending of the formal civil rights movement. After that, social activism splintered into a lot of different categories or a lot of different areas. So, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., who had been at the forefront of the civil rights campaign, focused on issues related to poverty. He was part of something called the Poor People's Campaign. So he transitioned from civil rights to other other types of activism. And following the civil rights movement, there are a lot of different types of activism that emerge. And so this section is going to talk about some of those different varieties. One of them is the activism or ideology of Black Power. And Black Power was, we'll describe it as a militant approach to the issues of civil rights. In essence, the civil rights movement was not completed with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and there's still more progress that needed to be done, especially in terms of the types of discriminations and disadvantages that African Americans faced in society. It advocated for a self determination for Black Americans. Probably the face or at least the most recognizable leader of the Black Power movement was Malcolm X, which is the face of the Black Power movement. He was a member of an organization called the Nation of Islam. This was a black nationalist organization. And, those that were part of those that were a part of organizations like the Nation of Islam or the Nation of Islam in particular embraced Islam. And this was, and we'll talk kind of about how Black Power, how it interacts with the previous civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. One way was in terms of religion. So it's not to say that everybody who was part of the Black Power movement converted to Islam, but certainly Malcolm X himself personally and members who joined the Nation of Islam, and this was meant to reject Christianity. Islam was viewed as a much more, or as the traditional religion in Africa. Islam was Islam was a much older religion, especially in Western Africa, where a lot of those who were enslaved were brought to the United States during the slave trade. Christianity was viewed as a European religion. In some sense, it had been forced upon Black Americans, and so rejecting Christianity, embracing a truer or more African religion, at least in their eyes, was one way of doing it. You also saw this embrace of national identity, even in terms of the way that Malcolm X adopted the name. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little, but like many of those descendants of African Americans who were brought to the colonies in the United States during the Atlantic slave trade, a lot of their family history and information was unknown. And so last names were often assigned to enslaved Africans from their enslavers. And so the name Little, that was viewed as not, again, Malcolm's true last name. And so he rejected the last name Little and instead used the name X, Malcolm X. Um, his approach to civil rights was a lot more confrontational. For example, Malcolm X advocated that Black Americans arm themselves in order to defend themselves. He says, quote, I don't call it violence when it's self-defense. I call it intelligence, Malcolm X. And again, this is advocating for Black Americans to arm themselves with weapons. The slogan that is more closely associated with Malcolm X and Black Power is by any means necessary. And so once again, when we compare this to the earlier civil rights movement, the slogan of by any means necessary as compared to the message of nonviolent civil disobedience, this provides us a chance to see the way in which Black Power is different from the civil rights movement in the 1950s and on. Here's an image of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Malcolm X in the glasses, Martin Luther King Jr. Here in 1954. Malcolm X, like a lot of other people in the 1960s, he was assassinated in 1965. Malcolm X had actually moved a little bit closer to King's position, and it was members of the Nation of Islam that killed him. Other signs of this embrace of a newer approach, more confrontational, militaristic approach to civil rights. We also find this in organizations like SNCC, right? Recall SNCC helped organize things like sit-ins, work towards racial integration, led by Stokely Carmichael, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, embraced much more of a sense of Black self-determination that is not to rely on anyone else besides Black Americans. SNCC would eventually expel white members and reject integration. We'll just say reject integration. And a big part of this was Black self-determination or independent, better way. Additionally, the formation of the Black Panther Party in 1970 also was a signal. This was formed in Oakland, California, and oftentimes wore military uniforms and I don't know if brandished is the right word, but we'll use it. Brandished weapons. And again, this was, really in stark contrast to, the not just the message that Martin Luther King Jr. had, but even just the appearance, right, of a reverend calling for nonviolence and calling for civil disobedience. So, symbolic of the more confrontational approach. Now, as far as Black Power is concerned, it was a much smaller movement than the civil rights organizations. But if we go back earlier and think about the way that social activism changed after the 1960s, it would have been one of these smaller areas of activism that broke out as a result of it. Now, one thing about the civil rights movement was it was integrated, so you had men, women, white, black, north, south. It was a pretty encompassing movement. And so there had been other people part of the civil rights movement that after seeing the success of the civil rights movement, they were, it made them more aware of the types of discriminations and uh, prejudices that they face for their own identity, right? The civil rights movement was focused primarily on African Americans, but after seeing the success and being part of it, Americans thought about the way that their identity interacted with, the law and politics and economics, and what could be done to remedy some of those problems. So we see activism happening on multiple fronts. So, for example, Red Power, very similar to the idea of Black Power, but this was activism for Native Americans. And Native Americans face similar yet unique um, challenges that African Americans had faced, from the civil rights movement and beyond. So we see a lot more activism in terms of trying to remedy the problems that Native Americans face in American society. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, this was an organization to bring attention to issues Native Americans faced. And, there were certain, incidents and events that, really stretched, really reached into the public, right? In the same way that the sit-in protests and the freedom riders made it to the television and made it to the newspaper so Americans became aware. Similar protests were held by Native American activists that also made Americans more aware of these types of issues. Two that were somewhat noteworthy during this period. One was the Alcatraz Island occupation. Alcatraz Island, this it actually used to be a prison in the 1950s. I think Al Capone was even in Alcatraz. But Alcatraz Island was eventually abandoned, and the land just stood out in San Francisco Harbor, wherever that is, vacant. And so Native American activists, they went out and they occupied that island, and this was to symbolically, not, I don't know if you'd say steal it back, but it was a symbolic of taking their land back. Pointing to the fact that, or pointing to the history of the way in which Native Americans were pushed off their land by the United States, and so they occupied that island, I think, for about a year. And then there was also a protest staged at Wounded Knee, and if you recall from way back ago, Wounded Knee was the site of the last Native American sovereignty within the United States, and so that area held a historical significance. And so these were both big protests that again reached the American masses in terms of bringing more awareness to the issue. Additionally, another strain of activism stemming out of civil rights or in the aftermath was the Chicano movement. This is Mexican American activism. And probably the most well known was Cesar Chavez, well known Chicano activist. And he followed, much more so, the civil rights MLK strategy. Things like hunger strikes, marches. Less of the more confrontational approaches. You could see how maybe these ones are a little bit more confrontational, kind of like the sit-ins and the freedom riders. The hunger strikes, the marches. This is a more of King's message of civil disobedience, and really what Cesar Chavez was. The goal was he wanted better conditions for farm workers. And most of the farm workers, not exclusively, many of them were Mexican, but there was also some Filipino workers. Cesar Chavez did succeed in establishing the United Farm Workers of America. This was a union created by Chavez or maybe thanks to Chavez, that improved conditions for farm workers. Those that supported the Chicano movement even branched into politics. Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez created La Raza Unida. We'll call this was a political party for the Chicano movement. The Chicano movement more broadly, we'll just make a note. Right? This was much more popular, specific. Popular in the Southwest, large Latino population. But comparatively speaking, like Black Power, relatively small in number when compared to the civil rights movement. And when we think about the different types of activism from Chicano movement, Black Power, Red Power, really the big one in terms of sheer numbers following civil rights is the feminist movement, or sometimes referred to, and I don't think your textbook necessarily uses this, is the second women's movement. Right? Second feminist movement, second women's movement. Either of those two are, acceptable. If we think about the first one, this was roughly speaking, let's see if I can get this date right. 1848, Seneca Falls Convention. 1920, that's the first women's movement. And this was all about voting, right? Suffrage. The second women's movement, or the feminist movement, it's not about voting. Women have the right to vote at this time. It's more about the discrepancies between men and women in things like education, jobs, and the way that women are depicted in culture. A lot of it has to do with the expectations that are, really constraining a lot of women in American society. And the reason why I say this is the big one is because women constitute half of the population, right? In terms of just sheer numbers, they make up a much greater share of the American public. So, again, a lot of women were part of the civil rights movement, and being part of the movement and seeing the strategies. Again, it causes a sort of a causes Americans to reflect on their own identity, and this allowed women to get the second women's movement, or the second feminist movement, get the ball rolling. Now, some of it did come from the government. In 1961, under President Kennedy, the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women was organized and executed. This investigated the status of women in the US, and, did propose, we'll say proposed, changes to things, proposed changes to things like employment, taxes, and various sort of benefits. Typically, we say that the second women's movement, or the feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s, started when the following book was published, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And in some ways, again, we might use this as an indicator to say, okay, here's the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. The Feminist Mystique, this was a book which talked about the, quote, problem with no name. Right? And this quote, the problem with no name, this was something that Friedan, the author of the book, had said that millions of middle class housewives, for the most part, were experiencing in American society. Right? Remember how we talked about in the earlier chapter the affluent society, where Americans conform to the culture of the day. It typically meant a nuclear household, a husband and wife, 3 children, and the roles that were set up for men and women in that society was that the men would go off to work and the women would stay at home and be housewives. And Betty Friedan acknowledged that yes, there'd been all this material and economic progress, yet women were still unsatisfied with their lives. And again, nobody really had a specific, nobody had really put their finger on it, right? They hadn't described it, but this feeling of emptiness, lack of purpose, lack of individuality, the fact that women lived for their husbands, lived for their kids, but never truly lived for themselves, that was the quote unquote problem with no name. So she says down here for down, she says there is a quote discrepancy between the reality of our lives as women and the image to which we were trying to form. The image I call the feminine mystique. So a lot of this being challenging the cultural norms, right? This is what women should do, should behave, should, dress, speak, and act like. And part of this feminist movement was to, was to challenge that. Um, Organizations took to, when the Feminine Mystique was published, it was a call to activism, right? Organizations formed, and people looked to change some of those things in society. One of those organizations was NOW, the National Organization for Women. We'll call this the organization dedicated to feminism and women's rights. And again, we're talking about things like equal access to jobs. So, for the ability for women to go out and get a job, because a lot of jobs only hired men. And in those days, you could essentially, do that. So, for the ability for women to go out and get their own jobs meant that they had some economic independence. So, if they were in a relationship where they had to depend on their husband, before there was really no way of, freeing yourself or breaking away from that. So, the ability to obtain a job meant that you can, break out of a potentially bad relationship. Things like education. Again, the same thing. Colleges had different standards for men and women, and there's still a lot of sex segregation in some of these things, and that's what the feminist movement was trying to open up. Two last quick things here in regards to other types of activism. One is environmentalism. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the heavy consumption of the 1950s, right? What did that do to our environment? And environmentalism was becoming more mainstream, right? The movement to, I don't know, we'll say preserve the environment. So, two examples: Earth Day, first celebrated. Earth Day is a day to celebrate the world, celebrate the environment of the world. It's like more about nature than people or something like that. On April of 1970. So I guess we still have that today. But maybe more importantly, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And this was somewhat ironically created by Nixon. But now the federal government was starting to pay attention more to the environment. And think about things like when we talk about just consumption, yeah, it's buying a lot of things, but also keep in mind something like pollution, right? At what level are we willing to get a bunch of stuff in exchange for pollution of the planet? And the environmentalists were trying to point out, look, maybe it's not entirely worth it. We talked actually about this last chapter, but Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. This was a big kind of breaking out moment for the environmentalist movement. But anyways, the EPA, this was an actual government agency created by Richard Nixon. This was dedicated to regulating environment, right? Telling businesses, hey, slow down for a second. Be more concerned about the type of pollution that you're creating when you're producing various goods. Also regulating things like smog requirements for cars, and you do see quite a market improvement in the environment from the 60s. 70s were probably one of the lower points, but moving into the 80s and 90s and 2000s now, pollution was pretty bad back then, or as bad as it is now. Was even worse before agencies like the EPA. And the last point is the Vatican II. The Vatican, if you're not familiar, this is the Catholic Church. And in a lot of ways, the Catholic Church is, a symbol. I mean, not just a symbol, but an institution of tradition. Again, kind of going back to the very beginning of this chapter, we think of the 1960s as a decade of change. So, Vatican II, which was a meeting by the Catholic Church and changes that the Catholic Church made. I mean, I think the idea here is that if, you know, the change in the 1960s was so significant that even the Catholic Church changed. So, for example, Vatican II allowed for what we call vernacular mass, right? Mass is the prayer. Before, the official language of the Catholic Church is in Latin, and all masses had to be held in Latin. The church said, "Okay, we'll change a little bit. We'll let people do mass in the vernacular." Vernacular just means the language that people speak. And two, more, we'll say, involvement. Say something else. Allowed a greater role for women